For the last speaker of this morning, we're going to talk, it'll be Dr. Brooks talking about varsity football players show significant changes in P3b event-related potentials due to accumulated subconcussive head impacts.
Good to know. Sweet. Hello, my name is Jeff Brooks. I'm a PhD student from Western University, and I'm here to talk to you guys today about our work with varsity football players that showed significant changes in P3b event-related potentials due to accumulated subconcussive head impacts. This work is done in collaboration with Dr. James Thompson of Evoke Neuroscience, as well as under supervision of Dr. Jim Dickey. I realize we're very close to lunch, so I'll try to make it a little shorter so we can get out to that nice spread out in front of you guys here. So bear with, bear with me. Little background first is I personally used to play football in university, and with that, I did my undergrad in physics. So I'm here in front of the big medical crowd, and I'm feeling quite intimidated. So I'm gonna kind of break it down for you guys as how I started thinking of my study and how it came to be. So when I first researched concussion, I found out it was a complex pathophysiological process that affects the brain and is induced by biomechanical forces. It's caused by a direct impact to the head or neck or an impulsive force to the body that transmits forces to the head. So when I looked at that definition, I was like, pathophysiological, didn't really know much about there. But I thought forces, impacts, I can do that. You know, played football, that makes some sense to me. So I looked into it a little further. I found out football has the highest proportion of concussions in all sports. That's basically due to the nature of the game, the high frequency of head impacts. Players are always hitting each other, and within every impact, you can basically break it down into linear and rotational accelerations. So a lot of the research that has been done so far has looked into that one big hit. They've looked into the hit that causes the concussion. They look at the acute symptoms or signs right afterwards to try to figure out basically a threshold of finding, you know, anything over this number of G's will cause a concussion. However, there hasn't been a lot of success so far in it, but more like a range in which someone is likely to get hurt. But to begin with, I was interested in how are you measuring these impacts in football? And it started back in the early 1970s with putting accelerometers on players' heads and gathering that data. Since then, it has evolved to some more advanced kinematic measuring devices, such as the G-force tracker, which you can see here, which fits inside the shell of any football helmet and will measure all kinematic data that it receives. So every impact a player receives to their head, this device can measure it. So looking at measuring of impacts, there's kind of two ways to think of things. You can look at looking at every single impact and breaking it down into, like I said, the linear and rotational components, looking at where on the head the impact occurred. And that's a lot of data to look at, and under the great advisement of my supervisor, I guess that's why they're so wise and they're called supervisors, we decided to stick with the keep it simple, stupid component, where we looked at purely a hit count idea. So hit count is an initiative that was started in the US with the Concussion Legacy Foundation, and it's basically used to monitor head impact exposure over a certain period of time. So whether that's a season, a player's whole career, whatever the case may be, and trying to be able to monitor it and hopefully reduce the exposure. Of particular interest to me was a study I came across by Talavej and his colleagues that involved monitoring a high school football team using a head impact kinematic measuring device and comparing their inputs of hits to their, they had fMRI as well as neurophysiological tests. And they compared concussed athletes versus non-concussed athletes during the season. As they expected, they found that there were deficits in those neurophysiologic functions for the concussed athletes when compared to the non-concussed athletes. But of the bigger interest was in the non-concussed athlete group, they had subclinical group basically that showed the same or similar deficits as the concussed group, but they didn't present signs of concussion symptoms. So when you're thinking of that, we're starting to see that all the other little hits seem to be having some sort of effect on a player's brain. Going further, an average Canadian university football game has a player will endure about 24 impacts per game, but this can range anywhere from as little as 2 impacts to over 100, depending on the player's position and the time that they see on the field. So you can see that's a great range. And what are all these little impacts doing to the head? So just because they're not maybe hitting that threshold that people are thinking is what will cause a concussion, maybe they're all just below that threshold. So you'd have to think intuitively that they must be having some sort of effect. So that's kind of the basis for the study that we started at Western. The next step was finding a way to measure an output to see actually the effects that these are having on the brain. And we decided to go with electroencephalogram, or EEG. So EEG is the neurophysiologic measurement of brain electrical activity. It involves putting electrodes on the scalp, as you can see here, and measuring the electrical activity that originates from the brain. And it's been used in many studies to examine brain activity after concussion. So we chose a certain aspect of EEG called ERPs, or event-related potentials. And these potentials are a time-locked EEG technique in response to a stimulus. So basically you have a stimulus occurs, and we know that at about 300 milliseconds after it occurring, we have what is called the P3b wave, and whose magnitude is associated with information processing, memory, and concentration. So now that we have kind of our output, we have our input of our hit count, we have our output of what we're measuring to see the effect on the brain, we've kind of developed what our study is. The purpose of our study was to evaluate the relationship between the number of head impacts a player receives in the sport of football and the P3b amplitudes. The study itself consisted of 45 members of the 2015 Western Mustangs football team. They consisted of, or broke down into 8 wide receivers and 9 defensive backs. And these players, if you're not too familiar with football, that's an offensive and a defensive side, or positions. And they receive similar types of impacts. So they're kind of playing against each other all the time. So we figured that they have a similar impact profile, so we grouped them in the same group. We call this the small skilled group. They're smaller in size, they're skilled in the fact that they still handle the football in the actual gameplay. The next group is running backs and linebackers, and we incorporated quarterbacks in with the running backs. We called this the big skilled group because they're slightly bigger, they're still skilled in that they handle the ball. And finally, our last group is the offensive and defensive linemen, and if there are any past or present linemen here, please don't take offense to being called a big unskilled player. You're still fully skilled, you're just not touching the ball as much, you're skilled in pushing each other around. So we term them as big unskilled. We took G-force trackers and installed them into the helmets, into every player's helmet, just to the right of the crown cushion, so the same spot in all helmets. And we measured the head impacts that players received over the course of the season, so that was 10 games and 53 practices. And then we measured their ERPs at 4 different time points using the EVOC system from Evoke Neuroscience. The 4 time points were, we did a baseline, so in August before the training camp had started. We did a mid-season test point, so that was after 5 games had occurred. A post-season test point after 10 games. And finally, we did a follow-up, which was 4 months after the end of the season, or the season had concluded. This is a layout of what the head impact kind of profile looked like for an average player during the season. We grouped it by our groups that I said earlier. Our y-axis shows us our number of impacts, x-axis is just the date through the season. What's pretty interesting, I find, is you can actually basically see the tail of the team through the season. So you can see training camp, there's a slow increase in the number of impacts. And then basically every kind of step you see here is a result of a game. So we can see how just one game can cause such a spike in our number of impacts. And then right around mid-season, there's actually, they had a bye week, so we can see there was a bit of a rest with very little increase. And then again, it continues until right before the playoffs, they had another bye week. And then they went on onwards, and the season ended. We also see our 3 time points here, where we test, or 3 of our time points where we tested, so our baseline, our mid-season, and our post-season testing points. And just to give you perspective, we again have our follow-up 4 months later. So to actually perform our analysis on our a priori hypotheses, we used one-tailed independent t-tests to compare high-impact to low-impact players at mid-season and post-season to baseline, because we expected there to be decreases in the P3b amplitudes. However, at the follow-up time point, we weren't sure what we were going to see, so we used a two-tailed independent t-test to compare it to baseline. And the big reveal, what you guys, I'm sure, came here for, are our results. So I'm going to break it down to you guys by group. We start with the small-skilled group, and we see right at baseline their test points. This is just an average over the group. So in red, we see our high-impact players, and green is our low-impact players. So when we measured them at mid-season, we found a statistically significant difference between the decrease in P3b amplitude from high-impact players compared to the decrease we see in low-impact players. So again, this is a small-skilled group, so this is our wide receivers and our defensive backs. And that's after only about 6 weeks. So that's, I thought it was pretty remarkable seeing such a change can occur in as little as 6 weeks. At postseason, we see a similar result. There's still a significant decrease in P3b amplitudes in the high-impact players compared to the decrease in the low-impact players. And then finally at follow-up, so that's again 4 months after the season had ended, there was no difference in the there's no statistical difference between the decreases from baseline to follow-up. Now we go into the big skill group, and we're actually seeing similar type of results. At mid-season, the players were showing, or the high-impact players, again, had significant differences compared to the low-impact players. At postseason, we also have a statistically significant difference. And at follow-up, there was no difference. So this was our linebackers, our running backs. We can group the quarterbacks in there as well. So again, we see that 6-week period, or after only 6 weeks, they're still seeing amplitude decreases. And at postseason, so about 12 weeks, they are also showing those deficits. Finally, for the big unskilled players, so again, our O-line, offensive linemen and defensive linemen, this time, interestingly, they did not show any statistically significant decreases between the two groups throughout the whole season, so at all 3 of our testing points, which is kind of remarkable considering they had almost double the number of impacts than the other 2 groups. So kind of taking this and looking at what it could all mean. We found that players that experienced a high number of impacts showed greater deficits in their P3b amplitudes compared to those that had a lower number of impacts. And we saw that in the small skilled and the big skilled groups. We found that there was a relationship depending on player position. So that would be the wide receivers and defensive backs and the running backs and the linebackers. And then we found that, or we thought, or saw that the players were showing a return to their baseline P3b amplitudes at the follow-up test 4 months later. Kind of stepping back and looking at this as a big picture as a whole and what it could mean is we found that keep it simple mannerism kind of worked. So we're showing that hit count does matter. The number of impacts the players are receiving is obviously having a effect on the players' brains. And we're seeing changes in as little as 1 season, or as I said before, in as little as 6 weeks. However, what we attribute to the big unskilled players, so the bigger guys who had a much greater number of impacts, but they weren't showing any differences, we think that may attribute to the fact that there's a magnitude or the impact magnitude may have some sort of effect, as there was a previous study done on the same football team a couple years earlier where we saw that all other positions showed larger magnitude of impacts compared to the offensive and defensive linemen. So we're thinking that although they have a very large number of impacts, they're of the smaller nature compared to those of the linebackers, running backs, wide receivers, and defensive backs. So those are players who play in space, have a lot more movement. So you see those bigger hits, the ones you'll see on ESPN, rather than the offensive linemen who are just bumping heads day in, day out. So our future work that we would like to do with this is we'd like to look at a comparison between our practice roster and our dress roster players to see if just playing that 1 game a week makes a significant difference. We'd like to see if we could develop some sort of algorithm with the number of impacts a player has, their previous history, whether that's with concussion or also just in their number of impacts, and then the kind of recovery time the brain has between impacts or games or so like large events of impacts. And then taking all of that and seeing how we can apply it to sport policy. So looking at prevention techniques as was alluded to earlier. So thinking of stuff like if you could extend the season so that we have more time between games, for example, to let the brain rest, but meanwhile still allowing for that thrill of sport and keeping the integrity of the sport intact. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope you guys enjoy lunch.
Lauren?
Hi, thank you. So could you remind us what you think a reduced amplitude P3b signal might translate to functionally, like a slower reaction time?
It associates with, so P3b amplitude associates with information processing, memory, and concentration. So we're seeing it as players are not being able to concentrate as much. They're slower in their information processing. So it's more like, although it's not significant maybe in the fact that they you don't see it as because you see them day to day. So someone who's interacting with them all the time may not see that, but that's showing up on their, in the measures that we had.
So did any of them get a concussion, and were those the ones who had a lower amplitude, if you look at a case-by-case basis? We
had 5 cases of concussions in our sample size, yeah. And we didn't go by case by case. We were going big picture, but that's certainly something that we'd like to look into is what kind of if it's similar between each of our concussion cases.
Okay. Due to the time, we're going to head to lunch, and we'll ask that you come back at 1:15, and you'll be available during lunch, hopefully, to take questions. Great. Thank you.